Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to join a number of my colleagues in strong support of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. These venerable institutions, which both recently celebrated their 50th anniversaries, are a cornerstone of American cultural expressions. Sadly, they are also under attack. The President's recent budget outline called for the defunding and dismantling of the endowments. So I've gathered here with my friends and colleagues in the hope that we can help the President change his mind and demonstrate to him the immense benefit that the NEA and the NEH bring to our districts, our country, and in fact the world. Being a Rhode Islander, I've always felt a special connection to the arts and humanities. Rhode Island was founded as a colony that welcomed free expression of religion, and that freedom of thought quickly translated into an independent mindedness that drove creative endeavors. Now, it is no wonder then that into such an environment was born one of the 20th century's great statesmen and a champion of the arts, our late senior senator, Senator Claiborne Pell. Senator Pell was a mentor of mine, and I actually had the privilege of interning with him twice at one point. And he is rightly lionized for many of his legislative achievements, including the Pell Grants that bear his name. But I believe that no issue was closer to his heart than that of preserving and promoting American art and culture. Anyone who knew the senator knew that his own passions was reflected and redoubled by his wife, the indomitable Nuala Pell, one of the greatest supporters of the arts in my state and our country that I've ever seen. And the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities can trace their beginnings to the passions of the Pells, the vision of President Kennedy, and the determination of President Johnson. President Kennedy began his term with a focus on American culture when he invited Robert Frost to read a poem at his inauguration. He soon followed this up by appointing August Heckscher, his special consultant on the arts. Heckscher's report, quote, entitled "The Arts and the National Government," led to the creation of the President's Advisory Council on the Arts. Meanwhile, Senator Pell, the chairman of the Senate Special Subcommittee on the Arts and Humanities, was hard at work. He began his first hearing in 1963 with this statement, and I quote, "I believe that this cause and its implementation has a worldwide application. For as our cultural life is enhanced and strengthened, so does it project itself into the world beyond our shores. Let us apply renewed energies to the very concept we seek to advance, a true renaissance, the reawakening, the quickening, and above all, the unstunted growth of our cultural vitality." I end quote. So over the next 2 years, working with legislators including Senators Hubert Humphrey and Jacob Javits and Representative Frank Thompson and William Moorhead, Senator Pell crafted President Kennedy's vision into a reality. With the full support and assistance of President Johnson, the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act was signed into law on September 29, 1965. The first chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, incidentally, was another Rhode Islander, Barnaby Keeney, then president of Brown University. So, Mr. Speaker, I begin this hour with a survey of history for a couple of reasons. First, I think that it is vital that both members and the President understand the care and consideration that went into creating the endowments. So years of deliberation by some of our finest legislators went into the determination made in the arts that, and I quote, "While primarily a matter for private and local initiative, the arts and humanities are also appropriate matters of concern of the federal government," end quote. So there is no doubt that private foundation and corporate philanthropy are the bedrock of artistic funding in this country. Nonetheless, there is an important role for government at all levels to play, and the endowments serve as the catalyst for governmental involvement. Second, Looking back helps remind us of the aspirations that drove the creation of the endowments in the first place. Last week, we learned of the death of Yevgeny Yevtushenko, a Soviet poet who defied his totalitarian government. When President Kennedy brought poetry to his inauguration, it was in direct contrast then to the Soviet Union, where literary dissidents were imprisoned or exiled and not given freedom to create. What a message to send to the world in the 1960s that the United States prized artistic expression, celebrated scholarly inquiry, and believed in the strength and progress embodied by multiculturalism. So the playwright in New York was not censored, he was cheered. The historian in North Carolina was greeted not with accusation but acclaim. The painter in Nevada was not imprisoned, she was empowered. Placed in context, the message sent by the creation of the endowments was that America's culture was not just an asset to be protected, but a powerful tool for promoting freedom worldwide. So, just as importantly, the 1965 Act recognized that American culture was not static. Rather, its evolution over time was the source of its power. However, I believe the most important reason to begin with the history of the endowments can be found in the Arts and Humanities Act itself. When I quote, "An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other great branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future." End quote. So why do we study the arts and humanities? Why do we promote them in the halls of Congress? To better achieve to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future. So, Mr. Speaker, I co-chair the Congressional Caucus on Cybersecurity, a caucus that owes its very name to the work of an artist, William Gibson, who first coined the phrase cyberspace in 1984. Gibson helped create the lexicon that we use today to describe the Internet as we know it, and in so doing, helped to shape its development and growth, a better view of the future indeed. For years, I promoted the STEM to STEAM movement, the concept of adding art and design to the STEM disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Incidentally, this movement is another product of my home state, courtesy of the brilliant minds at Rhode Island School of Design, in particular, as I understand it, former President John Maida, who, as I understand it, again, coined the term STEM to STEAM. Incorporating principles of art and design in STEM helps foster creativity, encourages collaboration, and can engender sudden, inspired breakthroughs, all by helping to better analyze the present. So in my role in the Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees, I'm presented daily with new threats brought on by the advent of new technologies or fast-moving global events. So the temptation to act quickly is strong, and sometimes immediate reaction is warranted. But more often than not, it is through examination of the past that I find a path forward. These United States have weathered many crises over the centuries, some of our own making, and by better understanding them, I can better analyze the present and better see a future of America peaceful, prosperous, and free. Mr. Speaker, I know my colleagues have stories to tell of the great works the NEA, NIH have supported in their districts, and I will share some of those stories as well. But I hope my words on the history of the endowments have helped shape our understanding of their incredible purpose and the ideals of President Kennedy, President Johnson, Senator Pell, and their colleagues. America is better for the endowments existing. The world is better for it. To cast them away and a budget outline that zeroes them out without even a word of justification is a tragedy. It dismisses the ideals of our forebears as insignificant. It ignores the half-century of work that many of my colleagues here have done to promote our culture through the endowments. and it is in the cruelest of ironies, it does so without engaging with the very disciplines it dismisses as unneeded. It cannot and will not go unchallenged. So, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, who has co-led this effort with me and who proudly co-chairs the the caucus on the humanities. I yield to my good friend.
I thank my colleague for yielding and for taking out this special orders to focus on the role of the endowments on the arts and the humanities in American life, and the need for us in this body to have some historical perspective and appreciation of that, and to rise to the occasion of the challenge presented by the Trump preliminary budget to make certain that these efforts are appreciated and more importantly, that they're funded, that they're supported in this body and in our budget for fiscal 2018. I'm glad that the gentleman took some time to give us a history lesson. He comes by this advocacy honestly because he's a representative from Rhode Island, and the inspiration behind the endowments back in the 60s was Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, a towering figure in the Senate, and I suppose I'm one of the few members around here who has been around long enough to remember Claiborne Pell. I never served with him, but I was a young staff member in the U.S. Senate when Claiborne Pell was going strong. I first got a job as a summer intern and then returned summer after summer, ended up writing a dissertation out of the Senate office of Senator Bob Bartlett of Alaska, who was a friend and collaborator of Claiborne Pell's. But Pell had many things going. I remember his chairman, Senator Lister Hill of Alabama, when I interviewed him at one point, he remarked on Claiborne and how just Claiborne had everything going. You had to really work to keep up with him. But these endowments were favorite projects of Claiborne Pell and of that uniquely fertile period in the history of this Congress when these efforts were pioneered and established, and of course they've enriched our national life ever since. As the gentleman from Rhode Island mentioned, I have been honored to co-chair the Congressional Humanities Caucus. Also have been a member for a long time of the Congressional Arts Caucus. And so it's at least in part in that capacity, I speak out today in defense of these endowments, but also as a U.S. citizen, as a former academic who appreciates the role both of these endowments play in supporting academic life and research into our history, our culture, our national background, and not just research at the very top levels of our great universities, although they do some of that, but also the kind of local historical understanding that is developed through local arts councils and through local groups who research history and put on pageants and who educate young people and who do so much to enrich our national life from the bottom up. One of the strengths, I think, of both the arts and humanities endowments, maybe their greatest strength, is their grassroots character, how they work to make history and the arts real and tangible and meaningful to young people coming along and to our local communities. That's one reason their political support is so strong and is so broad in terms of the political spectrum. You know, we all know there have been times in the past where opportunistic politicians took out after the arts and the humanities, thinking that maybe they could get a point or two by pretending to be anti-elitist or something like that. And you know, those efforts fall flat because members of this body and most Americans know that the endowments for the arts and the humanities operated in anything other than an elitist fashion. They have managed to, at one at the same time, support the great achievements of our top research institutions, but also to fund all sorts of activity at the local level, at the grassroots level, that has enriched our understanding of who we are and where we came from. There was a commission on the humanities organized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences a few years ago. It was co-chaired by the distinguished president of Duke University, Dick Broadhead, and a prominent businessman, John Rao. And the heart of the matter is the report that they produced. And I would commend to colleagues that report. It's not a report designed to gather dust on a shelf. It's a report designed to be an action document to help us understand that the humanities in this country are an important part of our educational excellence. They're an important part of our competitiveness internationally. The humanities are important to national security and to the business world in terms of languages and cultural understanding and the kind of historical perspective that people need to operate in the modern world. And so we all have our stories about how the humanities have enriched our lives and given us understanding. I experience that every day, not in a direct application necessarily, but some kind of appreciation of where we've come from historically. What's the validity of some of these ideological arguments that we hear? What's the history of our institution and of our role at critical moments? There's so much that you are simply not, whatever your walk of life, whether you're a member of Congress or a business person or whatever. You know, you're not going to get an instant history when you need it. When you need to have that understanding and that perspective, you gain this only by virtue of your educational background and the what's available to you in terms of resources to deepen your understanding. And then you draw on that later, and it is extremely important to have that to draw on. So we need to situate ourselves in this body especially, situate ourselves historically and understand the challenges we face. And a broad liberal arts education is simply irreplaceable as a way of doing that. And there are no more effective champions of broad liberal arts education in all of its facets than the endowments on the arts and the humanities. They have a robust system of partnerships with state agencies, local leaders, philanthropic sector. I particularly appreciate in my district the Carolina Ballet, the North Carolina Symphony, which gave a wonderful performance at the Kennedy Center as part of a series to celebrate state orchestras last week. National Humanities Center in my district also, a home for first-rate research in the humanities where scholars come year in and year out. And there's an economic impact. That's sometimes not fully appreciated. But a recent analysis by the Bureau of Economic Analysis found that our nation's arts and cultural capacity produces over $700 billion in economic output and supports millions of jobs. Coming down to specific programs, in fiscal 2016 alone, Endowment for the Humanities Museums grants leveraged $33 million into an additional $104 million. That's a pretty good return. Quite a return for the American taxpayer. In fact, every dollar that the State Humanities Council gives out in grants since fiscal 2015 leveraged at least $5 at the local and state level. So there are all kinds of reasons for us to appreciate the arts and the humanities, the ways they enrich our lives, the kind of ways they equip this country and this country's young people to be insightful, to be creative, to think outside the box, to develop their skills and to the fullest extent for their own good and also for the good of our country. So, in the face of all this, how can it be? How can it be that the preliminary budget of the Trump administration proposes eliminating these time-tested and productive programs? I don't believe that will stand. I don't believe members of either party in this body will let it stand. The funding already is very modest for these institutions. I'm not talking about meeting the Trump administration halfway. I'm talking about restoring full funding for the endowments on the arts and the humanities and standing up proudly for these institutions and understanding and furthering understanding of the role they play in our national life. Where did this proposal come from? I know where it came from, an outside right-wing think tank. That's the only credentials that I know that this proposal from the preliminary budget has. I hope and believe that this was an overly hasty inclusion in that preliminary budget based on nothing much than this think tank's proposal. So I know it is up for reconsideration. I hope by the administration itself, but certainly by this body, as we put together our budget for 2018 and also our appropriations bills for the year. So we've got to stand up for our institution's prerogatives in this case, but exercise those prerogatives on behalf of our own constituents, our own communities, and two of the finest and most efficient and most effective uses of federal funds that are in the whole budget, the National Endowments for the Arts and the Humanities. So let's hold fast in our investment. It's one of the most efficient we make in terms of leveraging private, nonprofit, and corporate dollars, and it's one of the very most effective in enriching our national life. With that, I thank my friend again for taking up this special orders, and happy to work with him on this, and we will count on a cooperative effort going forward.
I thank the gentleman for his outstanding comments and his insights and his leadership on the arts and humanities issues, and as leader of as co-chair of the Humanities Caucus here in the Congress. I appreciate his efforts in helping to organize and co-lead this effort to speak out against the effort to zero out the national endowments for the arts and humanities in the budget. We hope it will not stand, and we hope that the President will reconsider his initial budget proposal. But with that, I am proud to now yield to a number of my colleagues, and I want to begin with the gentleman from New Jersey, no shrinking violet himself, someone who is artistic and colorful in his own right, but it would be it's no surprise to me that being from New Jersey, he would be here, since it was one of his late colleagues, the former congressman from New Jersey, Frank Thompson, who was the House sponsor of the National Foundation on Arts and Humanities Act, and it is my privilege to yield to my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, such time as he may consume.
Thank you, gentleman from Rhode Island. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to express my strong support for the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, and I want to associate myself with the comments from the gentleman from Rhode Island and the gentleman from North Carolina. As a former teacher, I've seen firsthand how important the arts and humanities are in educating our kids and bettering the society as a whole. It has been shown that exposure to the arts stimulates students' learning, their motivation, and their creativity. Those students involved in the arts score significantly higher in the SATs than other students. Now, more than ever, the arts often seem to be one of the first programs cut from a school or a government budget. In fact, this president has proposed eliminating both the endowments entirely, the first time any president has proposed such a measure. This has been supported by Democrats and Republicans because it is meaningful to the entire republic. The NEA, the National Endowment of the Arts, has already sustained significant budget reductions. The NEA appropriation is 12% lower than it was in 2010, a decline of $19.5 million. And while I understand when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority, I understand that this priority affects the spirit of the greatest nation in the world. The importance of arts and the humanities is not something we should even forget, even in the face of tough economic times. The arts support 4.7 million full-time United States jobs, and as you've heard, creates billions in economic activity each year. In New Jersey, the National Endowment for the Arts last year provided over $1 million in direct grant funding to 13 arts organizations, community groups, schools, and artists, as well as enabled the New Jersey State Council on the Arts to award 171 grants, non-grant services totaling over $13 million. So there is consequences and a ripple effect to the few federal dollars that are provided and targeted. In my hometown of Paterson, New Jersey, the Council for the Humanities has awarded grant funding to the Hamilton Partnership for Paterson in support of their work for the Great Falls National Historic Park. Humanities organizations like these enrich in historical benefits for the Great Falls through programming and community involvement initiatives. That's why it is crucial that we ensure that they receive the funding and the recognition they deserve. The budget proposal does damage to Americans across the board. One area taking a massive hit, if I may use a parallel, is health care. This budget would cripple the NIH, the National Institute of Health, slashing funding by $5.8 billion, equal to 19% of the current $30.8 billion budget, discretionary budget. The budget takes aim at vital anti-poverty programs that directly impact health care, because poverty causes poor health. So our physical health is going to take a toll, but it is our mental health that can be improved through a strong arts foundation, helping to relieve stresses and lift American spirits. Spiritual health of Americans, supported by the NEA and the NEH, is a key piece of our overall well-being. As an active member of the Congressional Arts Caucus, I've spent years opposing those who wanted to slash funding for the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. I will continue to work, and my colleagues, and I pledge to you today that I will, on these federal initiatives that possess widespread and bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans have always come together on this issue. It lifts the spirit of the culture and the nation. You mentioned Yevashenko before, a Russian poet came to New York City in the 50s. I only know a few words in Russian, but I went anyway because he was going to read his poetry in Russian. There was no interpreter there. He'd been in the midst of the Russian Revolution. He had been in the midst of people trying to gain a voice. I just knew a few words. Nonetheless, I was moved by his spirit, like watching a painting, or looking at a photograph, or going to a movie. I understand without knowing the words. That's what a poem should be. It should be, regardless of meaning, in any language. Whether it's music, art, poetry, sculpture, cinema, photography, dance. It doesn't matter. This is the heart of America. Our children are drawn to it. And we even use art now and the humanities to help those people through very distressing times, which is very, very interesting and fascinating. So I want to thank you, Mr. Langevin, great congressman from Rhode Island. I want you to know you have a partner, and once I partner, you know I'm not going to go away. So I yield back, and I thank those who did stay to speak about this very, very, very critical issue. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New Jersey. I know everyone's on a tight time schedule, and but I thank you for staying and contributing your thoughts and your support to this effort. So I thank the gentleman from New Jersey, and I know that my colleague from Rhode Island is on a tight time schedule to try to catch a train at noon. So I'm proud to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island, Congressman Cicilline, for his comments.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for convening this special order hour, and for your incredible leadership on this issue of the importance of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, not only here in Congress, but what you do back in Rhode Island to ensure that all Rhode Islanders have the ability to experience and enjoy the beauty of the arts and culture in our great state. As you know, and I'm sure you've already referenced, we come from the state of the late Senator Claiborne Pell, the founder of the National Endowment for the Arts, so we feel a special privilege and it's a great honor to be able to stand and defend this great institution. As has been mentioned, art not only nourishes our soul, makes us more human, but creates beauty in the world. And we have had a number of events recently in Rhode Island where we've invited artists and people who enjoy art to speak about what the impact might mean if we defunded the National Endowment for the Arts. And there were so many beautiful words that were shared, but a young woman said recently at one of these events, "Art helped me find my voice." And she described kind of what her life had been before she became an artist. And we know the economic impact of the arts. In my congressional district, there are 1,340 arts-related businesses that employ almost 7,000 people. We spend in this country a very modest amount, 0.0004%, so 0.004% is the budget of the National Endowments of the Arts. So it's a very modest budget. 40% of the programming from the National Endowments of the Arts supports activities in high poverty areas. So the contributions it makes are enormous to our economy. For every dollar that's invested in the arts, it yields $51 in economic activity. So there are tremendous economic benefits to this. But in addition to that, as was referenced by Mr. Price, arts and culture and creativity are central parts of the job skills for the 21st century. People want to employ people who are entrepreneurial, creative, problem solvers, and arts and music are some of the best vehicles to develop those skills. So it's something which is important to the future economy of our country, to the kind of civilization that we'll be a part of. It adds to the lives of everyone we represent, and I just want to say thank you for giving me a few minutes to reinforce the importance of funding the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It makes all the difference in the world and the kind of art experiences that people have in this country. We invest a very modest amount of money, and it yields so much more that it's hard to imagine America without the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. I thank my friend and colleague from Rhode Island for leading this effort and for convening this special order hour, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank my colleague, Congressman Cicilline from Rhode Island, for his comments and also for his partnership in helping to support the arts and humanities back home in Rhode Island and in our country as a whole. And as you said, we have a special connection to the arts and humanities, given the leadership of our late senior Senator Claiborne Pell, who really created the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities in the first place, along with the support of his wife, Nuala Pell, who David and I both know very well. With that, it is my privilege now to yield to the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Alma Adams, for such time as she may consume.
Thank you very much. I want to thank my colleague from Rhode Island for his dedication to the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and for organizing this special order today. As the 12th District Representative from North Carolina, as a practicing professional artist, as an arts educator, a curator, and retired 40-year visual arts professor, I'm pleased to join with my colleague in expressing, and all of my colleagues, in expressing my support for the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities. And I want to associate myself with the previous comments made by my colleague from North Carolina and New Jersey as well. I've learned throughout my professional arts education and arts management careers that, yes, the arts are nice, but beyond being nice, they're absolutely necessary and essential to enriching our lives. Artists connect to the past to the present. They convey our unique experiences, and they are presented in many forms, sometimes familiar and other times unfamiliar. A universal language. The arts speak to people everywhere to help them understand diversity in cultures and some of the most complicated issues. The arts and humanities are critical for adding value to our shared culture, and they're not just used to mark celebrations, but to challenge perceptions of society. Museums functions as tools to house and preserve our collective history as a nation and bind us together as one community. Visual artists reflect on our society, and they force us to reconcile our past, and writers record history and expose and challenge readers to different ideals presented in our society. And musicians, social and cultural boundaries connect the listener through the sound of their instruments. Time and time again, we have made a conscious decision to fund the arts and the humanities, signaling that we intrinsically value the arts as being crucial to our collective identity. The NEA and the NEH have been and continue to be necessary to the success of the arts and humanities in my home state of North Carolina. As a representative of Charlotte, one of the largest cities in the South, I understand how important the NEA and the NEH is to Charlotte's unique and thriving art culture. In 2016, the NEA invested $660,000 grants in Charlotte for programs such as the Children's Theater, the Journey to Oz, and the McCall Center for Art and Innovations. NEA grants make these cultural events possible, not just in my state, but in states throughout this nation. The arts not only provide entertainment, but they also encourage us to think critically. Advocates and researchers have shown that the arts have a positive impact on a young person's development. And because of this understanding, the arts and music were included in the Every Student Succeeds Act as part of a well-rounded education. The NEA is critical and is a critical component to ensuring strong arts education in our schools. Through direct grants, the NEA is able to support crucial preschool and to 12th grade education projects. By establishing partnerships with our colleges and universities, the NEA is able to encourage with our institutions of higher learning to provide grants to preserve and restore historic works of art. As a college art professor, I had the privilege of working with the NEA to secure a matching grant which allowed the college to preserve and restore a historic painting by Aaron Douglas, the father of the Harlem Renaissance. In order to continue to ensure that our students remain competitive in a global society, we must continue to fund the arts. In addition to the cultural and educational impact of the arts, they play an important role in helping our veterans transition to civilian life and combat physical and mental illnesses. Through the NEA Military Healing Arts Partnership, the NEA has worked with the Department of Defense to create an art therapy program to treat service members with traumatic brain injuries and associated psychological health issues at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. This program places art therapy at the center of a multidisciplinary treatment approach. Through art therapy, our brave servicemen are able to, and women, are able to receive specialized treatment that enable them to heal both their physical and their mental wounds. Participants in the program have found relief and have seen vast improvements in sleep and communication and pain therapy and their ability to confront emotional challenges. This program has also invested in critical research on the impacts and the benefits of this treatment. The NEA's budget for fiscal year 2017 was $148 million, just 0.04% of the federal budget, a small amount. Through a relatively small investment in the arts, we were able to yield large returns. And not only do the arts serve us culturally in terms of being significant, but the nonprofit arts and the cultural sector is an economic driver, supporting about 4.3 million jobs and contributing to a gross domestic product of 4.2%, or about $729 billion. The arts are crucial. They're critical to our culture. They're crucial to our education and to our economy. And in all respects, it is the arts that make us human. So funding for NEA and the NEH must remain in the federal budget. And I would urge my colleagues to support us in that effort to keep the arts as a viable part of our budget, which means that it will be a viable part of our communities. And I yield back, and I thank the gentleman so much for putting together this special order and for allowing me to have input today. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for her presence here today, but most especially for her outstanding words and participation in this effort. Thank you for what you've contributed here today, your wonderful perspective, and I hope it catches the President's attention and hopefully reverses this effort to zero out funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. Mr. Speaker, this is, some may think of the arts and humanities as just luxuries or extras, but they are not. They're central to who we are. It's also about the jobs they create and how the artists and the folks from the humanities contribute to our economy. They people who earn a living and pay taxes, and again are a vibrant part of our communities, our states, and our country. So that's something else that's important to remember. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud now to yield to my colleague from New York, Mr. Tonko, who has important perspective to offer, and I yield the gentleman at such time as he may consume.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from Rhode Island for yielding, and thank you, Representative Langevin, for leading us in this hour, and also for your great leadership on behalf of the arts and humanities. I am very pleased to join my colleagues in taking this time to speak about the critical importance of National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH. Any great civil society will grow even stronger by embracing the arts and humanities, and certainly America, when she embraces the arts and the humanities, grows to the greatest potential. So the greatness of America is reflected by that interest and that investment. At a time when some are arguing that we must cut our way to success, I would remind them that investments in the arts and in humanities are investments in our workforce and in our economy. I fully support funding for these programs. The National Endowment for the Arts provides a foundation for America's artistic excellence, her creativity, and innovation that benefits individuals, communities, and our industries. As NEA Chair Jane Chu once said, and I quote, "Although many may not realize that the arts actively intersect with areas such as the economy, human development, and community vitality," I close quote. The NEA, as a strong sponsor of the arts and artists, is an integral source of strength at these intersections, challenging students to turn imaginative ideas into brilliant solutions for generations to come. Art in our communities, and especially in our schools, is indeed vital. It is one of the most important ways that we celebrate our unique regional heritage and expand our own horizons of creativity and innovation. In the capital region of New York, the area that I am so proud to represent, we value the arts. So much of our artistic achievement would not be possible without the National Endowment for the Arts. For many years, the Albany Symphony Orchestra has received NEA grants in support of the American Music Festival. The Arts Center of the Capital Region has received NEA grants for exhibitions, workshops, and master classes. Yaddo has been the recipient of many NEA grants to support residencies for collaborative teams. Fence Magazine uses NEA grants for publication of books of poetry and podcasts. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute was just awarded an NEA grant for residencies to create works investigating the intersection of art, media, technology, and yes, science. Without the NEA, these programs would not be there to enrich our communities and our lives. National Endowment for the Humanities awards also support research and innovation, strengthen critical thinking and writing skills, as well as strengthen humanities education in all institutions of learning. Supporting the growth of the humanities in our communities is just as essential. The National Endowment for Humanities has contributed in many ways to the Capital Region, which has a very rich history and heritage worthy of preservation, promotion, and celebration. Many of our institutes of higher education have benefited from these grants, including RPI, Skidmore, Union College, and SUNY Albany, to name a few. Some of the projects that have been funded by NEH include the Underground Railroad History Project of the Capital Region, which explores the complex relationship between the Underground Railroad, the end of Civil War and Reconstruction in our region, as well as the influence of these events on our contemporary society. Investments in the humanities also drive us to be better citizens. NEH has supported the League of Women Voters of New York State Education Foundation, which is working toward the celebration of women's rights to vote and the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters in New York State to celebrate the upcoming events commemorating the women's suffrage centennial. Grant recipients include the Girl Scouts, the Troy Boys and Girls Club, libraries, museums, high schools, and elementary schools. Our history reminds us of the pride that comes with developing community and neighborhood, investments that those who came before us made in growing families, developing households, building neighborhoods in powerful and meaningful ways. This conversation is also closely linked to two other important fields that are intertwined with the arts and humanities. First, I am a longtime supporter of America's heritage areas, special places that have played important roles in shaping our nation. They tell the stories of people and communities, the pioneer spirit of which laid the foundations of our society. Heritage areas provide enormous economic benefits, and I greatly appreciate the work that the Erie Canalway and Hudson Valley Heritage Areas have done for upstate New York. As the co-chair of the Congressional National Heritage Area Caucus, I continue to be impressed by how the entire National Heritage Areas program operates on a very small budget. These cost-effective programs create jobs and grow our local economies. In fact, each federal dollar invested in this program leverages more than $5 in non-federal funds. That's exactly the kind of smart investing we need to see more of. And by the way, thank you to the 77 members who joined me in supporting funding for heritage areas. I'm also supporting funding for the Institute of Museum and Library Services because museums are a vital part of our communities and educational infrastructure. These museums collectively employ 400,000 Americans and have an impact of $20 billion in their communities. During my time in Congress, I've been a steadfast advocate for our nation's museums, and I've urged my colleagues to robustly fund the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the primary agency that supports our nation's 33,000 museums. It is highly accountable, and its great competitive peer-reviewed grants program serve all states. This year we had 166 members signing on to that letter. So it's very obvious. NEH, NEA, IMLS, and heritage areas are fundamental investments in our communities. They make life richer, more meaningful. They inspire us. They challenge us. They need to be funded. Let's move forward with the critical funding they require and deserve. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York for his comments and for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time we have remaining?
You have approximately 12 minutes.
12 minutes? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to yield now such time as may consume to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the gentleman from Rhode Island for yielding and for leading this important conversation. We come here today to call attention to a misguided turn that this administration proposes to take in our country's cultural history. I'm the only PhD physicist in Congress, so I frequently come to the floor to speak out in defense of science and scientific research, but I'm here today for another reason, to call attention to the grave threat that President Trump's budget poses to the future of our country's arts and culture. What is it that makes a country great? And how will our country be viewed a generation from now, a century from now, or in the next millennia? To answer this question, we can only look to the great nations of the past. Why was Athens great in a way that Sparta never was? Why is Florence, under the Medici, revered and remembered in a way that its forgotten competitors never are? It is because, after they defended their homeland, after they conquered their rivals in war, after they triumphed in commerce, that those countries invested a significant fraction of their national wealth in things that had nothing to do with material conquest. The Medici supported the science and the art of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and the Renaissance masters. And Athens supported the immortal accomplishments of the Greek storytellers, historians, artists, and philosophers. And that is what made them great. For many decades, our country has supported the arts and humanities through the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. Now, our president has proposed a budget that would cut these endowments completely in favor of more defense spending and a useless wall on our southern border. The National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities provide critical funding for students and organizations throughout the country, including in my district in Illinois. His budget proposes that we wipe them away completely. These cuts might make the president feel like a hero in the short term, but they will be a disaster for our country's place in human history. Programs that support understanding of the arts and humanities play a vital role in our society. They give us knowledge and a shared cultural base that we rely on every day, regardless of what career we go into. And they also help children and students of all ages embrace the complexity and the wonder of humanity. History, literature, and the arts connect us to a common past and allow us to explore our differences and to understand places beyond our own imaginations. Simply put, the arts and humanities teach us how to be compassionate and understanding towards other people. This is what makes America truly great. The National Endowment of Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, help show us what it means to be human. Because regardless of who you are and what you do, knowledge, empathy, and compassion are the national values and the human values that we need to defend, not with bombs and fighter jets, but with sustained support and the cultivation of knowledge and culture. Now, for most of my career in science, I worked at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. The founding director of Fermilab, Robert Wilson, spoke eloquently about this over 40 years ago. Bob was a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and who walked away from his security clearance and dedicated his life to pure science, to building giant accelerators, experiments, international collaborations at Fermilab to explore the fundamental properties of matter. And he was also an artist who, after he made all of the magnets and particle accelerators, then filled his laboratory with graceful and imaginative art. In 1969, he was called to testify in front of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy to answer why it was that we were spending all of this money at Fermilab during the Cold War and what all this had to do with the national defense. And Robert Wilson looked at the committee in the eye and said that all of the work at Fermilab, driven by natural human curiosity, has nothing at all to do with the national defense, except perhaps to make our country more worth defending. So I would hope that a president so bent on building his wall and increasing our defense budget by over $50 billion to the detriment of funding for education, science, and the arts would pause for a moment and heed those words from history, so that a century from now, when our children and grandchildren look back on this time in our country's history, they will see that the human values of our country were always what made it more worth defending, in part because of the greatness that the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities have sustained for decades. So I thank my colleague from Rhode Island for this important discussion and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois for his great comments and for his participation here today. It was very deeply impactful, and I'm grateful. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains?
Approximately 7 minutes.
Very good. Well, Mr. Speaker, like my colleagues, I too have stories of the impact of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities have back home, and some of these stories are small and deeply personal. I'd like to thank the wonderful leaders of the Rhode Island Arts and Humanities Councils for helping to collect them so that I can share them with everyone here today. The State of Rhode Island is deeply indebted to Randy Rosenbaum and Dr. Elizabeth Francis for their work promoting the arts and humanities. The state councils are an essential component of the endowment's efforts, and we are incredibly lucky in Rhode Island to have Elizabeth and Randy heading up our initiatives. So one of the stories they shared comes from FirstWorks, an NEA-supported organization that helps connect students experiencing new types of performance with artists premiering new pieces. So First Works recently helped bring together a Philadelphia hip-hop group with high school students in downtown Providence. So the students participated in a workshop with one of the dancers one day and followed it up with a lecture and matinee performance the next. So First Works just created a Spanish language version of their student survey, which they administered after the matinee performance. So students were asked to rate their enjoyment and explain why they gave their answer. Well, two Spanish-speaking students responded that they loved the performance because it was the, and I quote, first time they went to one. So the First Works team weren't exactly sure what the students meant. Was it the first matinee? Was it the first time seeing the hip-hop group? So they followed up with the teacher who wrote back. And this is what she wrote, and I quote, "These students have never been to a live performance. It just goes to show you how important these opportunities are for our population. They will remember this forever," end quote. So this is the kind of impact the arts can have on our communities. So another story comes from an artist who has, with the help of the state Art Council funding, been working with underserved communities for 6 years. So she helps students learn to apply themselves to art projects in a way that builds self-confidence and helps them learn the power of their imaginations. So an elementary school student named Danny, she wrote, and this is what the letter said, and I quote, when I first started working with him, he did nothing but whine and cry and insist that he couldn't do anything. So with my encouragement, he took his own ideas and went with them in a puppet workshop, and he made 3 stuffed animals instead. So he sleeps with them every night now, and they make him feel safe. Well, there are hundreds of these stories in Rhode Island alone, and they would simply not be possible without the support of the endowments. Of course, some projects supported by NEA and NEH are on a much larger scale, and it is virtually impossible right now to find a Rhode Islander who today doesn't know about Waterfire, Providence's massively successful creative placemaking project. So I've experienced this, the wonder of Waterfire many times myself. For those of my colleagues who have not had the pleasure of attending a Waterfire, and Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to extend an invitation to all of my colleagues to come and to visit. But it's a dynamic sculpture, basically, with dozens of these metal baskets or metal braziers transform the rivers of downtown Providence. So this groundbreaking artwork has completely transformed Saturday nights in Providence, with tens of thousands of people flocking to downtown for each lighting and the performances of music and camaraderie that accompany it. It's hard to describe in words, but it has been transformative. And Waterfire really has fundamentally altered the way Providence is viewed and the way the people of Providence view themselves. So support from NEA is helping Waterfire further explore creative placemaking, and it's incredibly meaningful. A final thought to share comes from Professor Tubi Ganesi, a board member of the Rhode Island Council on the Arts, Rhode Island Council on Humanities. So Professor Ganesi has asked to share her thoughts on why NEH matters for all Rhode Islanders, and I truly cannot improve upon her words. And this is what she had to say. So the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities uncovers beautiful stories about individuals and places and brings them to life. These stories become our history and make us understand that we too write the narratives that construct culture. Intentionally diverse programming that rich supports builds communities that eventually will view diversity as normalcy. This normalcy is the one I aspire to construct for the next generations. Rich allows for our best selves to come forward and celebrate together what culture teaches us, from the struggles of social justice to the legacy of First Peoples, to the craft of filmmaking for children. All of these things matter. All of these things make us better human beings. All of these things turn us into ethical and engaged citizens of the world. Without an understanding of the humanities, opinions opinions become facts, and truth is debatable. History has offered us a roadmap to behaving with integrity. We cannot ignore it, or ignorance wins. Well, Mr. Speaker, and I cannot think of more important words for these times, and I would ask all of my colleagues to reflect on what it will take to view diversity as normalcy and why it seems today that truth is debatable. Well, may I inquire how much time we have left, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Well, I thank all of my colleagues for being here today, and I was proud to share my thoughts on why it's so important that we not zero out the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities and the incredible impact that they have on our communities, and I yield back.